When marriage begins with the wrong question, a psychological and philosophical reflection on family conflict. There is an old observation about marriage that many people discover too late in life. It goes something like this. A household rarely becomes troubled overnight. More often, the seeds of conflict were planted at the very beginning when two people chose each other without truly examining the deeper structure of their character, their moral instincts, and their understanding of relationships. In other words, many marital conflicts are not sudden accidents. They are slow revelations. What appears to be a sudden explosion between spouses is often the final stage of a structure that has been quietly forming for years. From the outside, people usually explain marital tension with simple labels: personality differences, generational misunderstandings, or disagreements with in-laws. But psychological reality is rarely that simple. Some couples encounter conflict and learn from it. They gradually develop balance, negotiation, and emotional maturity. Other couples experience conflict very differently. Instead of becoming stronger through disagreement, their relationship slowly begins to shift into something else, a burden that must be managed, endured, or eventually escaped. When this structural shift begins, the marriage itself changes meaning. And when parents observe their adult children struggling in marriage, it is important not to interpret every conflict as a temporary misunderstanding. Sometimes what appears to be a small family dispute is actually a sign that the relationship's psychological architecture is already unstable. Today's discussion examines one particular pattern within that structure. We will explore a situation in which a wife gradually disconnects from her husband's parents and how that dynamic can place the husband into a very specific psychological position, one that often leads to chronic guilt, emotional paralysis, and eventually emotional burnout. Understanding this process is not about taking sides. It is about recognizing patterns. Because if parents are able to identify these psychological dynamics early, they may still have the opportunity to help their children stabilize a fragile marriage before it reaches the point of irreversible collapse. If you find this conversation meaningful, consider subscribing to the channel, sharing the video, and supporting the discussion. Sometimes the smallest act of sharing knowledge can prevent a family from quietly drifting toward deeper conflict. The first psychological stage: chronic guilt. When a man finds himself caught between his spouse and his parents, he often enters a psychological condition that social psychologists call chronic relational guilt. This is not the ordinary guilt we feel after making a mistake. Instead, it is a persistent emotional tension created by the feeling that, no matter what one does, someone important will be hurt. If his wife suffers emotionally, he begins to think, perhaps this is my fault. Maybe I failed to establish proper boundaries with my parents. But when his parents feel rejected or wounded, a different form of guilt emerges. Am I abandoning the people who raised me? These two moral obligations, loyalty to parents and responsibility to a spouse, collide within the same psychological space. And because both relationships are ethically meaningful, the husband cannot easily resolve the tension. Over time, this creates a repeating mental loop. The man begins to believe that he simply has not done enough. He tells himself, I should have handled this better. I should have prevented this situation. I should have protected everyone. But this belief slowly becomes a psychological trap, because the problem is not simply his behavior. It is the relational structure itself. The second psychological stage: decision paralysis. As the conflict deepens, another dynamic often emerges. The husband begins to experience forced choice pressure. This happens when one side of the relationship insists on a clear declaration of loyalty. A simple question begins to appear repeatedly: whose side are you on? At first glance, this may sound like a reasonable emotional request, but psychologically, it places the husband in an impossible position. Any answer he gives will damage one of his core relationships. If he prioritizes his wife, his parents feel abandoned. If he protects his parents, His wife feels betrayed. Over time, the husband learns something painful. Every decision produces harm. Once this realization becomes emotionally internalized, a new behavior emerges. He stops deciding. Instead of choosing, he withdraws. Instead of mediating, he remains silent. From the outside, this behavior may look like irresponsibility or indecisiveness, but in many cases, it is actually a form of psychological self-defense. He begins to believe that doing nothing is the least painful option. Unfortunately, the longer this state continues, the more the husband loses his confidence in his ability to influence the situation at all. His agency slowly disappears. The third psychological stage: emotional burnout. When guilt and decision paralysis continue for a long time, the psychological cost becomes enormous. The husband is constantly mediating emotions. He explains, he apologizes, he justifies, he absorbs anger from multiple directions. This process requires enormous emotional labor. Eventually, the system collapses. At this stage, many husbands experience what psychologists describe as relational burnout. 3 signs typically appear. First, emotional persuasion becomes exhausting. The husband no longer has the energy to explain or negotiate. Second, he begins to withdraw from emotional conversations entirely. Listening to either side feels overwhelming. Third, his energy declines, not only at home, but also in other areas of life, including work and friendships. And when this level of emotional depletion arrives, something subtle but important changes. He stops asking, "How can I solve this?" Instead, a new wish quietly takes its place. "I just hope nothing happens. I hope everyone stays calm. I just want peace." In psychological terms, this is not resolution. It is surrender. The hidden structural problem. At this point, it is easy to blame the husband for weakness or indecision. But the deeper issue is structural. He attempted to maintain balance inside a relationship system where mediation was never truly possible. In some relational dynamics, attempts at compromise are not interpreted as cooperation. Instead, they are interpreted as insufficient loyalty. When this happens, the more the husband tries to balance both sides, the more pressure he receives to demonstrate absolute commitment. The result is predictable. Guilt increases, helplessness grows, emotional exhaustion follows. And if this pattern continues long enough, the psychological system eventually reaches a point where maintaining the marriage itself begins to feel impossible. A question worth asking. When marriages begin to collapse, people often ask a simple question: what went wrong? But the more meaningful question may be different. Perhaps we should ask, what kind of relational structure was created at the very beginning? Because marriage is not sustained by romantic emotion alone. It is sustained by character, boundaries, emotional maturity, and a shared philosophy of loyalty and responsibility. Without those foundations, even sincere love can slowly transform into a psychological battlefield. And by the time the conflict becomes visible to everyone else, the deeper structure may have been forming quietly for many years. If this discussion has given you new insight into the hidden dynamics of marriage and family psychology, consider subscribing, sharing this lecture, and continuing the conversation. Because understanding these patterns early may help families avoid the silent emotional collapses that too often unfold behind closed doors. The hidden psychology behind rapid divorce decisions. In the previous discussion, we examined how a husband can slowly become psychologically exhausted when he stands between a spouse and his parents. We saw how chronic guilt, decision paralysis, and emotional burnout can quietly erode the inner stability of a marriage. But that story raises another important question. What happens on the other side of that relationship? What is the psychological process occurring in the mind of the spouse, who gradually chooses disconnection rather than reconciliation? And why, in some marriages, does the decision to divorce arrive? Not slowly, but surprisingly quickly. To understand this phenomenon, we need to look at a structural factor that often changes: the entire emotional calculus of marriage, whether the couple has children. Because when a marriage exists without children, the psychological and moral barriers that normally slow down the decision to divorce becomes significantly lower. And when those barriers are low, the decision-making process can accelerate dramatically. Why divorce decisions accelerate in childless marriages? Let us begin with the first psychological factor. 1. The absence of moral guilt toward a child. When a couple does not have children, one of the most powerful emotional restraints on divorce simply does not exist. In marriages with children, parents often hesitate to separate because they fear the emotional consequences for their child. They ask themselves difficult moral questions. Will my decision harm my child's emotional security? Am I destroying the stability of someone who depends on me? But when no child is involved, that moral calculation changes. The decision to leave the marriage is no longer framed as an act that harms another vulnerable life. Instead, it becomes framed internally as an act of self-preservation. Divorce in this psychological narrative is not experienced as destruction. It is experienced as rescue. The person tells themselves, I am not abandoning someone who depends on me. I am protecting myself from a relationship that harms me. And once divorce is reinterpreted as an act of self-protection, the emotional resistance to the decision becomes dramatically weaker. 2. The perceived cost of leaving is lower. The second factor is the psychological calculation of loss. In any relationship, people unconsciously evaluate what they would lose if the relationship ended. When children are involved, the perceived cost is enormous. Leaving the marriage means disrupting a family system, altering a child's daily life, and possibly losing part of one's role as a parent. But in childless marriages, that calculation is different. The person may conclude, if I leave now, I am not losing very much. There are fewer shared responsibilities, fewer irreversible commitments, and fewer structural ties. Because of this, divorce may begin to feel less like a catastrophic loss and more like the rational closure of an unsatisfactory contract. From a psychological standpoint, the relationship begins to resemble something closer to a partnership agreement than a lifelong covenant. And contracts, when they no longer serve their purpose, are often terminated. 3. The psychology of practiced disconnection. There is also a third factor that is rarely discussed openly. When someone has already solved one relational conflict by completely cutting off a relationship, such as severing ties with in-laws, they may unconsciously learn a powerful behavioral pattern. They learn that elimination of the relationship itself can remove emotional discomfort. Over time, this strategy becomes psychologically familiar, and familiarity lowers resistance. So when conflict appears within the marriage itself, the mind already knows a solution that has worked before. If the relationship causes distress, remove the relationship. What begins as the disconnection from extended family can gradually evolve into a broader relational philosophy. Conflict is no longer something to negotiate. It becomes something to remove, a structural shift in the meaning of marriage. When these three factors combine, the absence of moral restraint toward children, the low perceived cost of separation, and the familiarity with relational cutoffs, a profound shift occurs. Marriage itself begins to change meaning. Instead of being experienced as a lifelong social institution, rooted in shared endurance, it becomes experienced as something closer to an emotional satisfaction contract. In this framework, the marriage continues only as long as it provides emotional safety, validation, and psychological comfort. And when those conditions disappear, the relationship itself begins to feel invalid. From that perspective, divorce is no longer interpreted as failure. It becomes interpreted as logical completion. What happens when children are present? However, the psychological dynamics become very different when a child enters the family. Interestingly, in such cases, divorce often becomes slower, not faster. But this does not necessarily mean the conflict is weaker. In fact, the opposite is often true. When children exist, The disconnection that began with the in-laws does not simply disappear. Instead, it may evolve into a new relational structure within the household. The pattern can unfold in a very specific sequence. First, the spouse concludes that the relationship with the in-laws is unsafe or emotionally threatening and chooses to cut it off. Next, if the husband attempts to maintain even minimal contact with his parents, he may gradually be reclassified psychologically as someone who threatens that boundary. And finally, the only relationship that feels fully controllable becomes the relationship with the child. The child becomes the one person whose behavior, environment, and emotional loyalties can be regulated. And without conscious intention, the child may begin to function as a psychological stabilizer within a system filled with relational insecurity. The expansion of control. When this dynamic deepens, several patterns often emerge. Family visits become battlegrounds of negotiation. Communication with grandparents becomes restricted or eliminated. Disagreements between spouses begin to revolve around the child's schedule, education, and emotional exposure to extended family. Over time, the child can become less of an independent individual and more of a symbolic territory within the parental conflict. The child's loyalty, time, and attention become tools within the relational struggle. Ironically, this situation can delay divorce because both parents remain bound by the responsibilities surrounding the child, but the emotional intensity inside the household often increases. The conflict does not disappear. It simply changes form. The hidden lesson children may learn. One of the most concerning aspects of this dynamic is what children unconsciously absorb from it. Children learn how relationships work by observing the emotional patterns of their parents. If the dominant pattern they observe is that emotional discomfort is solved by severing relationships, they may internalize a similar relational strategy. Without realizing it, the family system teaches a silent lesson. Stability comes from cutting off what hurts. But this lesson can quietly shape the way the next generation approaches friendships, partnerships, and family life. A difficult truth about disconnection. It is important to acknowledge something carefully here. There is no official statistical category called the disconnection-oriented spouse. Human relationships are too complex to be reduced to such simple labels. However, counselors and family therapists often observe a repeating pattern. Individuals who resolve major relational conflicts primarily through total disconnection frequently repeat that strategy in later relationships. The next target of disconnection often becomes the person closest to them, and in a marriage, that person is usually the spouse. This does not necessarily happen because the spouse is the true cause of the conflict. It happens because the psychological strategy has already been established. Once disconnection becomes the primary tool for resolving tension, it tends to move from one relationship to the next. A lesson for parents. For parents who are concerned about the stability of their children's marriages, the most important insight is this. The real issue is rarely the divorce itself. The deeper issue is the relational philosophy that existed long before divorce became a possibility. If someone repeatedly resolves emotional conflict by cutting relationships off entirely, then the pattern will likely continue. The specific target may change. First the in-laws, then perhaps the spouse, and sometimes eventually other relationships as well. Understanding this pattern early can sometimes help families intervene before the structure becomes irreversible. Looking ahead. In the next part of this series, we will examine an earlier stage of this psychological pattern. Before relational disconnection becomes a rigid worldview, it often appears first as emotional instability and fluctuating judgment, especially in younger individuals navigating family relationships for the first time. Why do some people eventually stabilize and develop healthier relational boundaries? And why do others gradually solidify a worldview built around cutting relationships off? In the next lecture, we will explore the emotional patterns often observed in individuals in their 20s who struggle with extreme reactions to in-law relationships and why that stage sometimes represents the last window where meaningful adjustment is still possible. If this discussion has helped you understand the deeper psychology of family conflict, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this series with others who may be facing similar questions. Because sometimes the most important intervention in a family crisis is not dramatic action. It is simply understanding the pattern early enough to change its course.